Dr. Karen Malone is Chair and Founder of the Child Friendly Asia Pacific Network. She is also Professor of Education in the Centre for Educational Research at the University of Western Sydney. She's a global expert on children's environments, sustainable cities, children's participation, child-centred research and evaluation, child-friendly cities and children's rights. She has coordinated 3 major international research projects, including UNESCO Growing in Cities project, UNICEF Child Friendly Cities project, and the UK Policy Institute's Children's Independent Mobility Multi-Site International project, all of which underpin her belief that a child-friendly city and community is engaging to children and supports children's participation in planning. Throughout her research, Dr. Malone asked the pertinent question: how friendly is our community? So if you could all join me in extending Karen a warm Hobart welcome.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the invitation to be here. Now, I'm going to try my hardest to make sure I don't go over time, but I have a terrible reputation for talking way too much, so I know I'll need a lot of time out. So whoever's got that bell, keep ringing that bell, because I will move as fast as I can. Because some of the speakers today are going to do more of the talking about, the sort of instruments of play and the landscapes we can create to allow children the opportunities to think about ways to engage with their city. I thought I'd start the morning with providing a more theoretical framework for how we think about children in the city. And because my focus isn't just Australia, I think of it in a more international focus. I'm going to give you 2 sort of snapshots. I'm going to look at a project we've been working on in Sydney, and I'm also going to show you an example of some work I've been doing in La Paz in Bolivia, just to show you the extreme contrasts around the different ways we think about engaging with children in the city. One of the things that when we talk about a child-friendly city is always is to think about, what is our dream of a child-friendly city? If I asked you now to say, well, if you go to the city of Bendigo, it's been given the recognition as a child-friendly city, what would you expect to see there? What would be different than Ballarat or Geelong? What is it about this place that makes it a child-friendly city? And when we talk to parents about, their community, when they're thinking about what they want for their children, we ask them the same thing. What are their dreams and aspirations? What do we want in terms of, creating a city that would work for children? For many of them, they tell us, it's a place where children can play with their friends. And you'll see down here, these are some of the quotes from parents talking about their own childhood, so the things that they thought they were important. There was a playground at our end of our street and we would play there. Going to the vacant lot and playing with friends, using, loose materials that were available. Connecting with nature. People say that as a child-friendly city or a city that's for children is a place where children can connect with nature. They can engage with their friends in natural surroundings, out of the eyes of, gazing adults who want to regulate and structure everything they do. They want to do things like search for tadpoles and look for frogs, the sorts of things that, we may have experienced as a child, but children are experiencing less and less. Connecting with animals and engaging with animals in natural environments. Pets. When I don't do my research with children talk about pets a lot and the role that pets play as part of their engagement in the city. And we often forget to think about how we could allow children to have pets in some of our spaces. A lot of people say if I was going into a child-friendly city, what I would imagine is that I would see lots of children in the streets. So, it's a place where there's a visibility of children. They're out and about, they're doing things in the streets. This is a home zone in London in the UK where they've actually tried to create a transparent space so that the street becomes part of the footpaths and kids can use it as a play space. And of course the idea that, we used to be able to use streets to play games and cricket and setting up those sort of ad hoc activities. It'd be a place where children can walk to school, This is a walking school bus program, but wouldn't it be great if we didn't have to create these adult-centred walking school bus programs? Kids actually walk to school freely. And of course it would be a place where children could integrate with the community, so there would be an opportunity for them to have the same status and be recognised to be able to use spaces in the same way as adults are. When I asked those same parents, so they're reminiscing about, well, if I wanted a city to be great because these are the things I experienced as a child, we asked them, well, you know, would you allow your children to be part of the city in the same way that you experienced? And for many parents, they say things like this. I'd love my kids to play outside, but I just can't trust other people. There are just too many dangers these days. No way, it's too risky. I have a small baby, but my husband and I have talked about it, even though we want her to have opportunities to play. She won't be going past the front gate without us. And, you know, I try to make that up by taking them to the park and stuff, but it's hard because we're all so busy. You know, they might get kidnapped, killed, all of those things. So really, even though we talk to parents, they reminisce about a city, they can dream and visualise a city that's going to be a wonderful place for children. Behind the outcome of that is that for many parents, it's the culture of a fear of the city as a place that's dangerous for children that is the most influential. So what are some of the issues that children are facing in terms of their city? Well, for me, you know, these have just been picked up from my time, and they're not just Australianised. You know, this is around the world. The adult-centred worldview we have of cities, we plan them for adult activities as opposed to children's activities. Risk-averse planning, lack of confidence in children's competencies, and this is a really big one. If you don't think children are competent or you don't value children's competencies, then you're not going to allow them to have spaces within the city. The fear of stranger danger, the focus on mediated experiences, the erosion of green spaces, increased defensive industries, the increase in traffic and car domination, barriers to access services and support, the speeding up of children's lives, and we've heard a lot about this, you know, kids who are moving from activity to activity, and the lack of social connectedness. And, you know, the lack of social connectedness generally, of course, impacts down on children. So these aren't things that are new. But what we've been able to do in our research is to think about ways that we can help cities set up projects where they can evaluate how well their city is going, and then think about ways to try and develop strategies or plans to build from these spaces. So I'm just going to give you a little bit of insight to the way that we theorise around some of this work. In my research work, my main job in many cities around the world for the Child Friendly Cities work is to help cities think about how they can evaluate or monitor the child friendliness of their cities. And I use it around three schemas or framing theoretical areas. I look at the view of childhood, so how a community and a culture takes up and understands or values and believes the notion of children and childhood. We talk about participation, and we talk about participation from social and environmental participation, and we also talk about the environmental qualities of a place. Now, you might go, well, here Karen's about to give us a Sociology 101 course in theoretical framing of the world and society, but it's really, really important for us to realise is that we need to, at the same time as we're thinking about the physical space, we need to understand the culture of a place. Because if we're planning for children, we need to know how people feel about children and childhood. What is the philosophy and the beliefs that are driving them? Because if you're in a community who doesn't believe that the most important aspect, or one of the most important aspects of childhood is for children to have freedom and play and opportunities to move around, if that's not important to them, then it's very difficult to convince them that, you know, these things need to be shifted or changed. And childhood is a very different thing than thinking about children. Children are a biological entity. Childhood is actually the philosophical value we give to a period of time. So, what is a rich and engaging childhood that we can create in a city? And I won't go into this too much, but ontology is the ontological completeness that we give in terms of children is really important. In dominant frameworks, when we think about childhood, we used to see childhood in a binary with adults. So often we see things like, this is the child, this is the adult. The ontology of childhood has been framed around the idea that children are becoming adults. So in other words, the whole notion of childhood is about moving them from being a child to being an adult. In the new sociology of childhood, or the framing that we use, we talk about being rather than becoming. So in other words, a child isn't becoming an adult, it's being a child. If you think about it in those terms, what you're really thinking is that it's about creating the quality of life for a child now around cultures of childhood, not thinking about how we can move children into adulthood or their personhood down the road. And if you don't see it, if you see it around this notion of binaries, if you think about something like play, we can frame different ways of thinking. It's very easy for us to dismiss notions of play as being childish, and that they're not serious. What is work? What is play? What is the difference between children playing and working, or working and playing? And those are the sorts of binaries that we play around with when we're doing our research. So we try to understand how a culture understands childhood and how they're positioning children within their schemas. We also talk about social participation, so the opportunity that a culture or a community is providing for children to participate in their society. And it's not just about creating youth parliaments or creating, formal structures. It's about the everyday social participation and the social agency that we give children. So what sort of opportunities are they given to be able to take up space in their communities and be able to make some decisions around that? And again, not often decisions like, whether or not this park is here or not, but decisions about whether or not I can have the freedom to move around my space. We also talk about the notion that children are being marginalised in adult-centred society. So talking about the power relationships that exist between children and their families or their adults. And one of the things that we start to see is that it's not so much that children can't be or aren't given these sorts of prescribed roles within communities. It's just that we're often very uncomfortable about providing children with the sorts of participatory or agentic roles. So children are and must be seen as active in the construction and determination of their own lives. So part of our research is, how do you actually evaluate that? How can you go into a community and do research to find out whether or not children are taking up social agency? And then there's environmental participation. And this might be something you're more familiar with, the idea of how children might participate in the environment around them. And wayfinding is one of those areas that we evaluate. So the capacity for children to navigate through the environment and be able to problem solve in terms of moving through. One of the ways that we evaluate that environmental participation is through the notion of independent mobility. And independent mobility is the capacity for children to move freely and safely through the environment without the accompaniment of an adult. And I'm going to show you some ways that we do that. So what I'm showing you here is, firstly, we theorise around the view of childhood. How do we understand how a community is constructing children and childhood? We need to then understand the role that children have in participating in the social constructs of their community, but also their participation in terms of moving through the space. And then the final one is to think about the environmental qualities of the environment. And often this is the one we think about the most. What sorts of things have we created that are available for children in their communities, whether it's natural spaces that they can have access to, or whether it's structured, elements that we've put into the landscape particularly for children. And just move on from that. One of the ways that we've been thinking about this is from the Growing Up in Cities project that we did many years ago for UNESCO. We developed a series of indicators of environmental quality for the international context. And environmental qualities, kids are very clear. These were actually developed with children across 10 countries in the world. They identified what were the positive and negative qualities of the environment for them. And we can use these sorts of indicators, and we also use a whole series of different sorts of surveys and tools as ways of assessing the quality of the environment. And when we're framing this up, we use the theoretical work around environmental affordances. So when we're thinking about environmental qualities of an environment, we're not just talking about what elements are there, but we're also talking about the function of the elements that are there. So environmental affordances are the capacity for certain features in the environment to be taken up, used, shaped, constructed by children or adults in those environments. And if you're interested to have a look further, you can work some of the work by Louise Chow from University of Colorado. She does a lot of work around how you can construct these notions of the accessibility, so independent mobility, and also affordances. And another person that I use a lot of their work with is a woman called Marketa Kieta. Sorry, I lost the bottom of it. She's a Finnish researcher. She's been doing a lot of research also around this relationship between environmental affordances, so the things that are in the environment, connected with the opportunity for children to be able to move around those spaces. So as you can see here, even if you have high independent mobility, that means you have high opportunity for children to access spaces in their community, unless there's something there, so unless there are qualities or environmental qualities available to them, then it's going to be a dull environment. A child-friendly space has high independent mobility, and it also has high environmental affordances. So that's the sort of optimum that we're searching for. So that's the sort of theoretical frame. When I go into a community and they ask me to evaluate the child-friendliness of the city, these are the three areas that I look at. The view of childhood, the sorts of accessibility or opportunities for social and environmental participation, and also the environmental qualities of the space. So for those who, most of you will be familiar with what Child Friendly Cities is. So Child Friendly Cities is an initiative that was developed in 1996. It's been going for 17 years now. It was developed at the time of bringing together the Habitat 2 Convention, as well as also the Convention on the Rights of the Child. The focus is putting into action the Convention on the Rights of the Child, and essentially as a movement it's been moving along at a very slow pace in many ways, but very country oriented. The Secretariat used to be in Florence in Italy. It's now moved to New York. The focus of Child Friendly Cities has always been to try and provide the sort of tools or a framework for cities to be able to create and evaluate the quality of their cities and think of ways to improve their cities so that they can improve the opportunity for the principles of the Convention on the Rights to be enacted. Now, in terms of where are they at the moment, the Child Friendly Cities program, and this comes out of the State of the World's Children report, which actually last year focused on children and the urban environment. They talked about how valuable the Child Friendly Cities movement has been and how much it has impacted on the opportunities for children in cities around the world. At the moment, there's 62 countries in the world that are involved in the Child Friendly Cities movement. And in Australia alone, we have at least 40 cities that are on the register as being involved at some level of child friendliness programs. The only city that was ever registered as a child friendly city through UNICEF was the city of Bendigo. And that accreditation came through at an international level. We actually don't have an accreditation process for child friendliness in Australia. Child friendliness status comes via a UNICEF office. And because we're a highly developed nation, we actually don't have a country office that does internal projects. So at this time, they haven't taken up the idea of giving recognition or status in terms of UNICEF towards child friendliness. But other countries in the world have taken a different sort of route. So Italy, Spain, France, Norway, the Netherlands have all got child friendly cities accreditation programs. And many of the least developed nations around the world also do. The biggest program in the world is actually in Brazil, and it has over 1,700 cities registered as child-friendly cities or in the process of being child-friendly. So the focus of the Child Friendly Cities project is to take these rights, so children's rights in a city, and look at ways that you can ensure that a city is fulfilling the rights of the child. You know that countries who have signed on to the convention, and all countries have, bar the US and Somalia, once you've signed on to the convention, you have to do a 5-year reporting on the state of children in your country. And so the opportunity with the Child Friendly Cities has always been the possibility of developing qualitative data about children's quality of life. At the moment, most of the State of the World reporting on children is just quantitative data that comes out of large, sort of national surveys. So the Child Friendly Cities movement has been working very closely with cities to try and develop more, fine-grained data about what's happening in children's lives. There's a framework of action. You can go and see this up on the web that provides a sort of series of steps or key elements that a city might think about when it's framing its Child Friendly Cities program. The most essential, I think, of all of these steps, and the framework of action and some of the tools that are up on the website are actually in the process of being revamped and relaunched, so it's probably going to come redundant pretty soon. But anyway, the focus really is about collecting data and trying to find out what's going on in a city for children. And to me, that's the fundamental first step. When people say to me, if I wanted to be a child-friendly city, how can I go about it? I said, the first thing you need to know is what are children experiencing in your city? What's going on for them? Because how can we plan to improve the space if we don't know what's actually the experience of children? So this afternoon I'm going to go through a workshop and show people some of the methods that we use in more sort of detail in our child-friendly evaluation programs. But just to give you an idea of what it looks like, I'll show you just 2 city programs that we've been involved in. The DAPTO Dreaming project was funded by Stockland Urban Developers, which was really quite an unusual relationship. I've never worked with an urban developer before. I've always seen them a bit like the enemy. So it was like, whoa, okay, this is interesting. But the interesting thing about this project is that for the first time, and this is something I've often, sort of dreamed about the possibility of, is that most of the time we're retrofitting cities. We're looking at bad planning that's gone on before historically, and we're trying to think of ways to improve the environment from where it is. So we're stuck within the constraints of what's there. In Australia, where we're doing these huge urban developments out on the margins, it seems so ridiculous that we don't plan them from the beginning thinking about children. Yeah. So when I was having conversations with Stockland about this, they decided to do this as a pilot program. And what they wanted to do was to think about how they could engage kids as the key stakeholders from the beginning in the designing of the urban development. And so my job was to help them develop a process. Now, DAPTO, if you're not familiar with it, it's down sort of south of Wollongong. It's on the very margins of sort of the urban cusp of the Wollongong city. The neighbourhood that we were working with is a place called Horsley. The actual development is going to come sort of south of this community. So, in fact, all the children living in this community are going to be the ones who are most connected to this new development. So the idea was to get them on board, help them design the space, and also get them to think about how they could utilise the new development as part of enriching their own environment. You'll see here too, down the bottom there is, that's actually the primary school. And The primary school were amazing because, in fact, the primary school staff, or the principal particularly, worked out pretty easy early on in the process that, in fact, the new kids coming into this development are going to be going to that school. And actually, the opportunity to keep that school, you know, sort of going was going to be dependent on how many kids did come to the school. So they became involved in the project as well. So we worked with the school and also the kids in the community. So going back to that idea about, you know, what is the view of children and childhood, and then also looking at those different aspects. So here's some views of the community. And we give children cameras, videos, interviews, stories, surveys, and we do what's called guided tours. And we develop the data with them around, you know, giving us a view of what that community looks like for them. So here's some kids out and about doing their reconnaissance missions of the neighbourhood and taking photos along the way. As well as taking photos, we get them to tell us the stories, and you can't see that. This is from Lachlan. He's aged 11. This is what he said. This were the natural spaces that he likes to play in. Georgia, this is her local playground. This is where I play. So they take the photos, and then we have what's called a photo voice elicitation interview with them. So they tell us about what those photos mean to them. This is my neighbourhood park. This was also Lachlan. He was 11. The old farmhouse, which is on the edge of the community where the kids go and play. Some little leftover places where the kids go fishing. Tadpoles, frogs. And some of the more sort of, you know, mainstream playgrounds that are also available. And you can sort of imagine, you know, you're talking about this, and then this is what we created for them, and the local skate park, of course, which for many of the younger kids, you know, this is a fairly contested space because, you know, there's a lot of issues around the older kids bullying and so forth, but it's still a space that they like to go to. So they're the sort of natural environment elements, and then thinking about the streets and the way the commercial spaces are set up, so the images come through from kids, their pictures. They also take pictures of their homes. We get lots of pictures of drive-bys. So all in all, if you think, you know, we had 60 children involved in taking photographs, and all of them took around 24 photographs each, plus we had an interview with them. So we ended up with an enormous amount of visual data of what it looks like to be in that space. And then the kids would show us how that they would put those together. So we sort of like have this sort of image of their daily activities as they move around. So this gives us a sense of the qualities, but also the affordances, how these places function in terms of what they do, why they're important to them. We also get them to draw pictures of their neighbourhood. Now, with this DAPTO project, we worked with kids in the kindergarten as well as grade 5. So we were working with kids who were 5, 6-year-olds, also with the sort of 10, 11-year-olds. So they draw a picture of their neighbourhood and they tell us about the elements of that picture. And this is from Logan, talks about his neighbourhood. Moving around, footpaths, being able to, you know, negotiate the space is really important for many of the children. And we can also do a sort of analysis. We ask them to draw a dream picture, so we ask them, well, if you had a dream space, what things would be in it? And we can do a sort of quantitative analysis of the elements in their dream drawings, and we can also ask them to talk about their dream drawings. So this was Noah, he was 5. Brodie, who's 11, talking about what her ideal neighbourhood would look like. And Paul's neighbourhood. It's interesting, the drawings that the children came up with were a lot messier than the very, you know, if you look at the photographs of the neighbourhood they're in, they actually wanted much more elements in the spaces. One of the concerns they had, and there were lots and lots of pictures, you know, DAPTO was a sort of 70s, 80s urban development, and there's lots of big wide streets, and it's very, very open. And the children, you know, were talking about the need for it to be more interesting, more diverse, much richer in the way that the development was put together. So in fact, a much more dense, I suppose, and you know, if we think about sustainable cities, it's probably a better picture of what a sustainable community might look like. There's Zane with her drawing, and this was Jack. And interesting, Jack ended up being on our reference group. He continued on. If you can see there, he's built a big slide on his community of what he wants in his dream playground here. And he continued to lobby for this slide, and in fact, when we built the playground the following year, he continued, and we ended up using it as one of the key elements in the architectural design of the playground. So he had an instrumental view of what he wanted. So that's environmental qualities and affordances. We also do what we call child mobility surveys, and these are given to parents and to the children. And this is to find out the sort of environmental mobility that children have, so their environmental participation. From the surveys, what we can do is look at what parents' experiences of childhood were in terms of moving around spaces, what their concerns are in terms of children's safety, and then we also then compare that with the children's view of their movement around the spaces and also about their concerns around their safety and the elements that are there. So questions like, how did you get to school today? Clearly, most kids in Australia walk to school. Go to by car, don't walk to school. When we also asked a question, if you had a choice of what mode of transport you would like to be able to go to school to, the highest one was actually cycling, which was really interesting. But the concerns, when we sort of did some focus groups around this, we actually found that, you know, one of the biggest concerns about cycling was the danger, because the big wide streets means that, you know, traffic moves very quickly through the neighbourhood, you know, and there was concerns about children's safety. So walking to school, the different licences. Now we call these parental licences, but it's really about, you know, the elements of negotiation that go on around key activities that children might engage in of their everyday life. So the more licence a child is given by a parent means they have more independent mobility. So travelling home from school was probably the one that you can see. Now this is actually a comparison. I'll pop this one in. Actually, this is a comparison of Australian data with other countries in the world. So yeah, this was just to show you that as these surveys are a survey that is used not only in our work, but it's actually worked globally. So you can compare children's independent mobility from DAPTO in Australia with you know, children in Japan. You can compare it with children in Tanzania, also in Europe. So the children's independent mobility is a good scale because it gives us a sense of how is it different in Australia than other places. And also, we went back to the community. After we did this project and the surveys, we said to Stockland that there was a real concern about children's independent mobility. The fact that children didn't move around the space. We wanted to try and encourage kids to walk to school more. So Stockland funded a walking school bus program in this neighbourhood as part of their sort of community engagement. So a year later, we went back and gave the same surveys to kids who were now in grade 6, also the kids in grade 5, and then also kids that were in grade 2. And what we're actually able to see from, you know, from the original data was actually we're starting to see a shift in their transport modes. So over a year of the introduction of the walking school bus, we've actually got kids now walking to school. We've got some of them catching the school bus more often, and some of them even cycling, which was great because this is what the kids had said they wanted. Other questions you might ask, who they travel to school with, so if they do go by walking, their perceptions of their neighbourhood. So this is one from the parents, asking the parents if there's adults in the neighbourhood that will take care of their children, and also asking parents if they're allowed to go to school alone when they were a child, what are the constraints that they now see as the reasons why they would let their children do the same thing. And you can see that, parents, clearly the risk of stranger and traffic are the two most fundamental issues for children that parents worry about. So that's mobility. We also do what's called a Child Friendly Cities survey. So we ask kids about their city. So we did this with the children in Dapto. Again, we did this with the kindergarten kids and the grade 5. What are their favourite places in their neighbourhood? Their least favourite places? We also asked them what are some of the issues for children in the neighbourhood. Places that are especially constructed for children. And, whether they visit their local playgrounds, how often, that sort of information. We also asked them, a question like, we could say, why are you lucky in terms of what is it about that's great about the place that you live? And they gave us lots of really fabulous answers around, what makes their community a good community for children. So overall, the results from the research with DAPTO clearly showed that children had quite a lot of independent mobility compared to many other communities in Australia. Poorly in terms of other countries in the world, but for Australia it wasn't so bad. We also found that children had a great sense of connectedness and knowledge of the environment around them. So the fact that they had some independent mobility meant that they engaged with their environment and they understood the environmental qualities or the affordances that were available in their neighbourhood. They also had a great sense that it was important to take care of their environment. So when we asked them to be part of the project in terms of designing the new urban design, they were really, really strong around the importance of conserving nature and providing a way to create a sustainable city that would be gentle in terms of the way that it was structured into the environment. Now, let me give you a contrast. That's DAPTO, Australia. Now, this is a research project we did using the same tools, but this time in Bolivia, in La Paz. So kids were engaged in the project. Instead of a school, we actually engaged the kids as part of their sporting activities. What's very different about children in Bolivia probably than children in Australia is that in Bolivia, because there's so many kids and there's so little amount of educational resource, kids only go to school for half a day, so they only do 3 hours a day. So they have a lot of free time on their hands. Now, for the girls, that means that they have to actually spend time in the house doing house chores, and they're very domesticated in terms of what they have to provide for their families. But for many of the kids, it means that, there's lots of issues about, how you can manage your time, particularly the boys. So the La Paz City Council has been setting up a whole lot of structured programs to try and help kids play sport, do things with that time that they have, rather than, maybe doing more negative things. So we sort of capitalised on that and engaged with the kids as part of their sporting activities. And you can see here, the kids are living in the Alto, which is on the higher reaches of the valley of La Paz. La Paz is built in the valley. The main city is at the bottom of the valley. And as you go up the hill, it becomes more and more disadvantaged in terms of the children's quality of their housing and their family incomes. The reason being is because the altitude gets higher and it's actually more difficult physically to live up there, but also the landscape gets more and more dangerous because as you get onto the steeper parts of the valley, you end up with these hillside areas that are prone to landslides and prone to all sorts of environmental problems. So in this, I'm going to take you around. These are the kids taking us on a guided tour of their neighbourhood. So this is walking around. They've got cameras or disposable cameras, so they're taking pictures for us as they walk around. And it gives you a feel of what it's like to live in the city of La Paz. Very crowded, very dense, very small houses, a lot of issues over rubbish and pollution and dangers, lots of dogs, lots and lots of pictures of children with their dogs. And you can see here, very, very different landscape in contrast to the children of that. One of their playgrounds. In the highest regions in Takakara, where we were working, you can't actually drive into the neighbourhoods because it's way too steep. So the only way kids and families can get in and out is via these stairs. And some of the outer reaches, which, as I said, many of these areas are very prone to landslides and quite dangerous. So I'm just going to give you a snapshot. These are some of the kids, rather than I'm showing you some of the kids in terms of their little sort of stories. This is Maverick, he's age 13. This was his picture of his neighbourhood. So the sports fields are really important. These are the areas that have been built by the City Council specifically for children. Besides that, there's no real formal playground areas. These are his pictures of moving around his neighbourhood. This is the sports field where he goes with his friends. The walk up onto the top of the Alto, the forest. This is Valvita. She's aged 11. This is a picture of her neighbourhood, talking about the things that she has to deal with as a child. Particularly for the girls, they don't get as much independent mobility as the boys, and in fact one of the concerns we had about the research data for this project was that we found it really hard to get the girls involved, so it's actually very top-heavy with the boys in terms of the data. And many of the parents were a little hesitant about letting girls be involved in the survey work. This is Valvita at the park. Again, at her local park, and the sports field in the background, showing you, the steepness of the landscape that they're involved in. And the final one, this is John. He's age 7. This was his picture of his neighbourhood. And if you have a look at the photograph, this is actually the photograph. So you can see there he's drawn very clearly a good picture of the building next door to his house. This is the local shop. Many of the children work in the shops as well, so they're often, if you go into the little areas close to their homes, they'll be working there with their parents. This is his street near his house. It's very pretty and very beautiful. And this is a picture inside of his house with his mother and his sister, who he loves very much. And this is inside his house. This is his room. There were lots of pictures of inside of their houses as well. And the houses are tiny, so you're talking, probably a space as big as this area down here that they all live in. So the bedrooms for the kids, they actually don't have a bedroom. What they have is a sort of they call their room, but it's actually a space that's dedicated to them. So they'll have their bed, and then they'll have all their belongings, usually on a shelf with all the things that are important to them, and each of the kids will have that space. They have a lot of children, so they'll have often between 6 to 8 kids in each one of these family spaces. So it's a very, very small space to, be living in. So children spend a lot of time outside in the outdoors because they need to get out of those small confined spaces. And that was his dream city. Which, if you think about the images of where he lives and the density and the confinement of his space, the idea of, which if I took this picture and I didn't tell you it was from a child from La Paz in Bolivia, it could be a picture of a dream place from a kid in Australia, that sort of openness. So we also did surveys with the children, so that same child mobility survey, you can see here, children are all walking to school. The train would be for some of the older kids who might travel into high school. And we compare that with the parents, and you can see there that parents, you know, the culture of walking, you know, and moving around the space is obviously part of ongoing through generations. So they haven't had the sort of generational shift that we've had in terms of changing the modes of movement. How would you like to travel to and from school? Many of them would like to ride bikes, but unfortunately, actually, it's more about the topography that they can't ride their bikes, because it's almost impossible to get to their houses on a bike because of the staircases. And who did you travel with? And you can see that many of them do travel to school with their parents, and that's because their parents are going off to, you know, their own jobs down into the valley as well. Most of the schools are down the valley from them. And do they think that neighbours will look after their children if, you know, they're not available? And many of them said yes, that they agreed. So parents do believe that there's that sort of social trust or neighbourhood support available to their kids in the neighbourhoods. So you can see here that, you know, very contrasting, different sorts of data, but by using the same surveys and utilising the same sorts of methods and tools, we're able to see the differences and contrasts, similarities across those different sites. So the Child Friendly Cities program is built on this idea that you need to engage children as part of the participation in the development of the data. So using big, you know, ADI survey material or ABS work gives us a first, you know, entry point into a community, but it doesn't give us the diversity of children's experiences. It also doesn't give us the fine-grained knowledge of how children are functioning in spaces, and it also doesn't give children the sort of opportunity to be in the sort of I suppose, in the driver's seat in terms of the ways that they come to talk to you about the work that they're doing. So the Child Friendly Cities Research Initiative was developed 3 years ago. Since 1996, there has been no research program developed with Child Friendly Cities. It was pretty much that people were utilising different methods and tools that they had available to them, but there was no unified way of thinking about it. So they developed a series of research tools that were available for children, but also for parents, also community members, and also for government. So there's now a set series of self-assessment tools that are available that you can use. The tools are set around 6 domains. So you can develop your research data around those domains. And you can see here, this is an example of a children's survey. It's based on a fairly simplified view of developing survey data. And I actually went to Sudan in Africa where they were doing this. And instead of getting individual kids to fill in a survey, they actually made a big one which they put on the ground, and kids actually put their responses to it using stones. So you can take a very, you know, sophisticated way of thinking about data collection, or you can do it in very simple ways as a community-based participatory project. So in Bolivia, we trialled the survey, and you can see here, these are the sorts of questions around play that came out, also questions about your neighbourhood. There's also questions about things to do with the role, you know, as being active citizens, or their opportunity to be engaged as part of the community. Do they get asked by their council about things that are important to them? Would they like to have a city that has more trees? So these are the sorts of, and it goes through, so there's around 40 questions around those 6 domains. So what do you do with all this data once you get it? You know, you end up with mountains of research data, a lot of visual, place-based research data. And then there's the process of analysing the data. In most situations, if I have the capacity and we're, you know, on the site, we'll try and engage the kids in analysing the data with us. And you can see here in DAPTO, we got the kids to look at the data, and they used the data to help them identify what they saw as key themes that were coming through from what the children had said. So some of these themes are about the environmental quality, Some of them are about the view of children and childhood, and some of them are about accessibility or mobility. And you can see the children have put together some statements around why they believe these themes are important. The reference group was 12 kids that volunteered to be part of the process going on after the initial data collection. So these were the themes, just to give it to you more clearly. And we then developed a children's report. So not just to report to adults, but to report kids reporting to other kids. They took each one of these themes, they collected all the data that represented from the research work onto those themes and developed a report which was then given to all the kids in the community, so they got to see the results of their hard work. In City of Brimbank, we did a similar project, same thing, western suburbs of Melbourne, working in that same way, collecting all of that data, working with kids to act as a reference group. We developed a set of themes or indicators of child friendliness, put together the guide, and then from that we also created a child-friendly map of the neighbourhood. So they identified the 50 most significant places for children in their neighbourhood, and they put them on the map so that kids would be able to find them. And we also then used the themes that they had constructed from the data to use as evaluation of the spaces within the community. So you can see here we've identified the 50 children's places, and then we've got the children to evaluate them according to those criteria. It's a bit hard to read this one, but if you think about the bottom one there, this is of the 8 criteria, 6 of the criteria were fulfilled by this particular playground space. But for most of the parks and playgrounds, they were lucky to have fulfilled 1 or 2 of the criteria that children had said what a child-friendly space might look like. So it's children going in and evaluating then what's there and saying what needs to be done to improve those spaces to make them more child-friendly. Interesting enough, we did this research work, and then we gave it to the City Council, and then it's up to them to, to build on from that. A few years later, I connected with Rick McConaughey. Rick actually worked on DAPTO project with me, and you'll get to hear Rick talk a little later on. And we were talking at DAPTO, and he said to me, I'm working on a project at Brimbank. And I said, I did some research down there at Brimbank. And he goes, he says, were you the one who did the children's thing? He says, because when I arrived as the sort of play consultant to do an evaluation on how to improve play spaces in the community, the council gave them this, and the children's evaluation of the play spaces is his beginning point to do his research work around how to do it. So I was really, chuffed at the fact that it had kept going on, so, the voice of the children had continued on after that. For many cities, they'll take the research data that we provide for them and develop a strategy or a plan, a children's plan or a child friendliness plan on how to then improve, the city in terms of what the children have provided for them. So just to show you, in terms of those domains, Child Friendly Cities has also developed a series of indicators under those domains. Each of the indicators are connected to an article in the Convention on the Rights of the Child. So the survey questions then are related to indicators which are then related to articles in the Convention. So you can start to see if there are areas where, a city is not travelling well, is not supporting children, then you can see that they're not then fulfilling the Convention, and they're the areas that they would put into their strategy. And just to give you some examples of us going in and trialling some of these indicators, this is the indicators around looking at health and social services. This is a place in Solo city in Indonesia, looking at the indicators around providing the availability of social services for children. They've developed refuges. Issues around garbage in New York. This was an area that we explored with children. And also in terms of infant mortality rates, we actually worked in Kazakhstan. This has been an area that we've been working on and through the research, the data show that these were indicators we needed to build on. And this project, which was a great one, one of the biggest issues for children living in Solo City in Indonesia is mortality rates due to motorbike accidents. Unfortunately, what happens in Indonesia, which happens in many countries around Asia and all around the world, is that parents wear helmets but kids don't on the motorbikes. So you'd think, you need to wear one because of the dangers, but they don't put them on their children. And so we did some research around why parents didn't get helmets for their children, and actually we found out it was because of the expense, and because they felt that children grew out of the helmets quickly, so it wasn't a good investment if they're limited resources. So they sort of scratched their head in City Council, thought, well, what can we try and do about changing the mortality rates? So what they did was set up a free helmet borrowing scheme. And within 12 months, 50% of the mortality rates in this city dropped because kids were wearing helmets. So, really simple answers. But until you do the research and you find out some of these, fine-grained issues that are going on in communities and why, then you can't start to think of ways of improving it. For many cities, and I'm just going to finish here, I know I'm running out of time, but for many cities, the reason why they're involved in the Child Friendly Cities is because they want to be recognised and given some accreditation. And obviously they're collecting the data and getting the research and finding out what's going on and developing strategies and plans is the first step. The next step that they would want to do is then be able to be recognised. And recognition for many cities means being able to take the UNICEF logo and have it at their entrance to their city with a nice big sign that says, I've been identified as a child-friendly city. For most of the time in the past, what's happened in terms of accreditation is that it's been done at a country level. So it's up to a UNICEF office working within a country to decide to develop an accreditation process, and their country-based accreditation process. There was no global accreditation. So it meant that if there wasn't a UNICEF office operating in a country around accreditation, then a city couldn't get that sort of recognition. And this is what we have in Australia. We don't have a UNICEF office that has created an accreditation process. And part of that is because we're a highly developed nation. All of our funding or donor contributions that go to UNICEF are essentially employed to external projects overseas. And so we have a very small group of advocacy people in our office in Sydney, and they really don't have the resources to manage an accreditation process, which would, is, as you can imagine, could be quite huge if every, there's 40 cities in Australia now who are all, champing at the bit who want to get an accreditation as a child-friendly city. The way of going about it in a different way is sometimes it's also done by governments. So governments will take up an accreditation program. In Indonesia, actually, it's done by the Ministry for Women's Empowerment and Children's Participation. So they run a countrywide accreditation in partnership with UNICEF, but it's actually run by the government. In Australia, South Australia has taken up the gauntlet to actually start thinking about developing an accreditation process. They're looking to become the first accredited child-friendly state in Australia. The Premier has, developed a strategy and has created an accreditation program, which, just to give you an idea, this is the sort of accreditation model that they're developing. They're hoping to develop their accreditation over the next year. And they've already started, working very closely with cities around the workshops and developing of that. So, the next step, where is Child Friendly Cities going from here? It's been going for a long time. It had a huge review done at the end of last year. And the review process has seen that there's been some real concerns about the Child Friendly Cities program in terms of that. Yes, it's a good advocacy program. Yes, it's sort of nice that people talk about child friendliness. But one of the real concerns by UNICEF globally is that there was no strategic monitoring or evaluation, and that because there was no evaluation, that cities might be calling themselves child friendly when in fact they weren't keeping up to any standards or targets over time. So They could get the status and go, oh, I'm a child-friendly city, use it for all their marketing and branding, but then actually show no ongoing commitment to, getting better or improving or, reaching any targets. And that's because there was no global framework to do that. So the next step, and just recently a tender went out, which I was lucky to get, and the idea now is to do a review of certification around the globe. So I've done a review of all child-friendly city accreditations, and from that we're now starting to develop a set of global criteria and targets for cities around child friendliness. And it's going to be a model that works very similar to the World Health Organisation's Healthy Cities program, the Safe Cities staff, there's baby-friendly hospitals, there's a whole lot of models that we can use as a program for that. What that will mean, once we relaunch the Child Friendly Cities program, which we're hoping to do early this year, so March, April it will come out, it'll mean that any city can actually sign on to become a child-friendly city anywhere in the globe. But they sign on to an international framework, and within that framework there'll be standards and there'll be targets that will need to be met by a city to be able to fulfil the criteria. At the moment we're looking at the possibility of using the Global Indicators framework, and I'm not sure if people have seen this, Global Cities Indicators. You can sign on to this. Any city can sign on to this website. It's run by the World Health Organization in conjunction with the University of Toronto. And what you can do is sign on to this, and online you upload all of your data into it, so around the indicators. What we'll be doing for cities who want to be nominated not as child-friendly is that there will be a dimension of child friendliness indicators that will be laid across these global indicators. Once you've put your information up there, you will then have to develop a strategic plan around how you will move your targets to get to the targets that will be set for you, and then once you've proven that you've met your targets, then you'll be allocated child friendliness status. And those people who are given a child friendliness status will be given a universal UNICEF Global Child Friendliness status. So that's the sort of movements, what's happening. If people are interested, keep in touch. If you're interested to join the Child Friendly Asia Pacific Network, send me an email and I can put you onto the network so you can see what's happening in the region. And we're also keeping updates on what's happening in terms of the progress of this over the next few months. So thank you very much. I hope that was interesting, a little bit all over the place, but just to give you a sort of insight into the sort of complexities, I suppose, around this sort of whole notion of child friendliness. Sometimes we look at it and sort of think, oh yeah, it's this very nice sort of twee idea, it's create a child-friendly city, and it's very, sort of all about just playgrounds and little places that we can create in cities for children. But actually at a national and international level, it's a much more complicated process around the importance of children's rights at much more deeper levels than just around the physical landscape that we create for children. Thank you.